I still remember every detail of that day. The way the late afternoon sun caught the steel cables of Cedar Falls' historic suspension bridge, casting geometric shadows across the wooden planks beneath my feet. The smell of funnel cake and cotton candy drifting up from the festival below, mixing with the metallic scent of the old structure that had fascinated me since childhood. The bridge swayed gently in the Oregon breeze, and I could feel the rhythmic vibration of footsteps as families strolled across, celebrating another bridge festival like they had for the past 50 years. I was 16 and completely mesmerized by the engineering marvel beneath me. While other teenagers clustered around the carnival rides or flirted near the food trucks, I found myself tracing the cable patterns with my eyes, imagining the mathematical precision that held this massive structure suspended over the Cedar River. Each wire told a story of tension and compression, of loads distributed and forces balanced. It was beautiful in a way that most people never bothered to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My parents had other things on their minds that day. Dad stood near the bridge's center, his work boots planted firmly on the planks, gesturing broadly as he talked with the Morrison family. His supervisor's voice carried that tone of forced joviality he used when discussing important family matters. Mom hovered nearby, smoothing her best dress and nodding at everything Mrs. Morrison said about young people settling down and practical futures. They were planning my life without me, and I knew it. Trevor Morrison stood awkwardly beside his parents, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was a nice enough boy, kind, hardworking, destined to follow his father into the factory like every generation before him. The kind of boy my parents considered suitable, safe, predictable. Everything I was determined not to become. I clutched the envelope in my jacket pocket, my fingers tracing the MIT letterhead through the paper. The acceptance letter had arrived 3 days ago, along with news of a full scholarship that would change everything. I'd hidden it from my parents, knowing the explosion that would follow. But standing on that bridge, surrounded by the casual assumption that my future was already decided, I felt something snap inside me like an overstressed cable. "Pauline!" Dad's voice boomed across the bridge. "Come over here, sweetheart. The Morrisons want to talk about the future." I walked toward them slowly, my sneakers silent on the wooden planks. The festival noise faded to a distant hum as I approached the group of adults who thought they knew what was best for me. Mom smiled nervously, the kind of smile that said she was already apologizing for whatever I might do. She knew me too well. "Now, Pauline," Mr. Morrison began, his voice warm but patronizing. "Trevor here has been asking about you. Seems he's got his eye on a nice house over on Maple Street, and he's thinking it's time to start planning for a family." Trevor's face flushed red. He met my eyes briefly, and I saw something there. Not love exactly, but genuine affection. Maybe even understanding. He'd known me since we were kids, had watched me take apart radios and build model bridges while other girls played with dolls. He knew this conversation was doomed before it started. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully, my hands still gripping the envelope. "But I have other plans." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Dad's face darkened, and I could see the familiar tightness around his eyes that appeared whenever someone questioned his authority. He'd built his life on the certainty that hard work, loyalty, and staying in your lane were the keys to a good life. The idea that his daughter might want something different was a personal insult. "Other plans?" Mom asked, her voice higher than usual. She was trying to keep things light, but I could hear the warning underneath. "Don't make a scene, Pauline. Don't embarrass us." I pulled out the envelope and held it up for them to see. The MIT logo was clearly visible on the return address, and I watched my father's expression change from confusion to horror. "I got into MIT," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Full scholarship. I'm going to study structural engineering. The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, festival goers continued their celebrations, children squealed on carnival rides, and couples took selfies against the bridge's backdrop. But in our little circle, time seemed suspended. Engineering? Dad's voice was barely controlled. Engineering is a man's job, Pauline, for spoiled rich kids who've never done a day of real work in their lives. Michael, Mom whispered, but he was just getting started. You think you're too good for us now? Too good for an honest living? His voice rose, drawing stares from other families on the bridge. Here we were, standing on a bridge that someone had designed and built, and he was calling it a fantasy. The structure beneath our feet was proof that engineering wasn't just theory. It was the foundation of everything we took for granted. I don't want to throw anything away, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. I want to build something, create something that matters. Trevor stepped forward, surprising everyone. Maybe you should let her try, Mr. Morrison. Pauline's always been smart, smarter than all of us.
Dad's face turned purple. Having his daughter defended by the boy who was supposed to claim her was more than his pride could handle. You stay out of this, son. This is about family, and family takes care of each other. Family doesn't run off chasing impossible dreams. Then why does it feel like you're trying to get rid of me? The words escaped before I could stop them, raw and honest and cutting. Mom flinched as if I'd slapped her. Pauline, that's not— we just want what's best for you. College is expensive and engineering— She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. And engineering isn't for people like us, I said, completing the sentence. She couldn't. Is that what you were going to say? That's exactly what I'm saying, Dad declared, his voice carrying across the bridge. Other families had stopped to stare now, sensing drama in the way people always did at small-town festivals. You stay out of this, son. This is about family, and family takes care of each other. Family doesn't run off chasing impossible dreams. Then why does it feel like you're trying to get rid of me? The words escaped before I could stop them, raw and honest and cutting. Mom flinched as if I'd slapped her. Pauline, that's not— we just want what's best for you. College is expensive and engineering— She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. And engineering isn't for people like us, I said, completing the sentence. She couldn't. Is that what you were going to say? That's exactly what I'm saying, Dad declared, his voice carrying across the bridge. Other families had stopped to stare now, sensing drama in the way people always did at small-town festivals. You think you can just waltz into some fancy school and become something you're not? You're a Williams, Pauline. We work with our hands. We know our place. Maybe that's the problem, I shot back. Maybe knowing your place is just another way of giving up. The slap came without warning. Not physical, Dad had never hit me, but something worse. He looked at me with complete disgust, as if I'd become a stranger in front of his eyes. Then you're not my daughter, he said, his voice cold and final. If you're so determined to throw away everything we've given you, if you think you're better than the life we've built, then go ahead. But don't expect us to be here when you come crawling back. Mom's face crumpled, but she didn't speak. She stood there, choosing her husband over her daughter, and that silence cut deeper than any words could have. I looked at her, waiting for her to say something, anything, to bridge the gap that was opening between us. But she just stared at the bridge planks beneath her feet. Trevor started to say something, but I held up my hand to stop him. This wasn't his fault, and I wouldn't let him get caught in the crossfire. Fine, I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. If that's how you want it? I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing on the bridge that had started this whole confrontation. Behind me, I could hear Dad's voice, still raised, explaining to anyone who would listen that his ungrateful daughter thought she was too good for her own family. The festival continued around us, indifferent to the small tragedy playing out on the historic bridge. As I reached the end of the bridge, I turned back one last time. My parents stood there surrounded by the Morrisons, Dad's face set in stubborn pride, Mom crying silent tears. The bridge stretched between us like a metaphor made real, a connection that had become a barrier, a symbol of the gap that now felt impossible to cross. I walked home alone, packed my few belongings into a backpack, and left Cedar Falls that night. The bridge disappeared in my rearview mirror as I drove toward Boston, toward MIT, toward a future that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. I had no family support, no financial safety net, and no idea how I was going to make it work. But I had the envelope in my pocket, and the memory of that bridge, the one that had ended my childhood and started my real life. Someday, I promised myself, I would build bridges that brought people together instead of tearing them apart. The first time I walked across the MIT campus, I felt like an imposter in someone else's dream. The brick buildings rose around me with an authority that made my small-town high school look like a toy. Students moved in confident clusters, their conversations peppered with casual references to places I'd only read about and concepts I was still learning to pronounce. Everyone seemed to know where they belonged except me. My dorm room was a sparse rectangle on the fourth floor of Burton and Connor, shared with a roommate whose father was a prominent architect and whose mother collected art. Rebecca had arrived with enough equipment to stock a small engineering lab and stories about summer internships at firms I'd never heard of, but knew I should have. I unpacked my single suitcase and tried not to think about how out of place I looked. The scholarship covered tuition and basic room and board, but everything else, textbooks, supplies, food beyond the minimal meal plan, was my responsibility. Within my first week, I'd found 3 part-time jobs: cleaning offices in the early morning hours before classes, tutoring struggling students in mathematics, and working weekend shifts at a coffee shop near campus. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My days blurred together in a cycle of exhaustion and determination. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. to empty trash cans and vacuum floors in the business school, then shower quickly and grab coffee before my first engineering lecture at 8. Between classes, I'd squeeze in tutoring sessions, helping freshmen navigate calculus problems while mentally calculating whether I'd made enough that week to buy the required textbook for my material science course. The academic work itself was challenging, but not impossible. Math had always been my sanctuary, and physics felt like uncovering the secrets of how the world actually worked. But the social dynamics were harder to navigate. My classmates talked casually about spring breaks in Europe and summer houses in the Hamptons. They complained about professors with the kind of entitlement that came from knowing their parents could make phone calls if grades weren't satisfactory.
I kept quiet and focused on the work. While other students formed study groups and built friendships over expensive dinners, I spent my evenings in the library, surrounded by engineering textbooks and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. The library became my sanctuary, a place where intelligence mattered more than pedigree, and where the problems had clear solutions. It was during one of these late-night study sessions that I first encountered the Tacoma Narrows Bridge case study. Professor Henderson had assigned it as supplemental reading for our Introduction to Structural Engineering course, and I found myself completely absorbed by the story. Here was a bridge that had been beautiful, innovative, and ultimately catastrophic. The engineers had underestimated the power of resonance, had failed to account for the way wind could turn a stable structure into a writhing, destructive force. I stared at the photographs of the bridge's collapse, watching the roadway twist and buckle in ways that seemed impossible. There was something almost personal about the failure. The way confidence had given way to chaos, the way what seemed solid could become suddenly, dramatically fragile. I thought about my parents on the Cedar Falls Bridge, their certainty about what my life should look like, and wondered if they'd ever considered that their own foundation might not be as stable as they thought. Professor Rachel Henderson was exactly the kind of woman I hoped to become someday. She was tough without being cruel, brilliant without being condescending, and completely unimpressed by the usual markers of privilege that seemed to matter so much to everyone else. She'd grown up poor in rural Alabama, worked her way through Georgia Tech, and earned her PhD at Stanford before joining the MIT faculty. She understood what it meant to be the only person in the room who'd ever worried about money. The first time she called me in class, I was ready. We were discussing load distribution in suspension bridges, and she asked me to explain why the cables were arranged in the particular pattern we were studying. I stood up, my voice steady despite my nerves, and walked through the mathematical principles governing tension and compression, the way forces moved through the structure like water flowing downhill. When I finished, Professor Henderson nodded slowly. "Excellent analysis, Ms. Williams. You clearly understand that engineering isn't just about memorizing formulas. It's about seeing how forces move through structures, how everything connects to everything else." After class, she asked me to stay behind. My heart hammered as the other students filed out, chattering about their weekend plans. Was I in trouble? Had I said something wrong? "You're the scholarship student from Oregon," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I've read your application essay, the one about bridges as metaphors for connection." She studied me with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. "Are you finding the work manageable?" The question was loaded with meaning. She wasn't asking about the academic difficulty. My grades spoke for themselves. She was asking about everything else, the parts of college that privileged students took for granted. "I'm managing," I said carefully. "I'm sure you are, but managing and thriving are different things." She moved to her desk and pulled out a folder. "There's a research position opening in my lab. It pays 20 hours a week, and the work would count toward independent study credit. You'd be helping with my earthquake simulation projects." I stared at her, afraid to believe what I was hearing. Research positions were usually reserved for graduate students or undergraduates with connections. "I'm only a freshman," I said. "Yes, but you're a freshman who understands that bridges are more than just getting from one place to another. They're about connection, about spanning impossible gaps." She handed me an application. "Think about it, but don't think too long. I need someone who can start immediately." I walked back to my dorm in a daze, the application clutched in my hand like a lifeline. For the first time since arriving at MIT, I felt like someone had seen me, not as a scholarship case or a small-town kid trying to prove herself, but as someone with real potential. That night, I called in sick to my coffee shop job and spent the evening researching Professor Henderson's work. She specialized in seismic engineering, designing structures that could withstand earthquakes by moving with the earth rather than fighting against it. Her bridges were built to flex and sway, to absorb massive forces without breaking. There was something beautiful about the concept: strength through flexibility, survival through adaptation. I filled out the application that night, writing carefully about my interest in structural resilience and my desire to understand how buildings and bridges could be designed to survive catastrophic events. I didn't mention that I felt like a catastrophic event myself, that I was learning to survive through my own kind of structural adaptation. But maybe Professor Henderson understood that already. The research lab was a controlled chaos of computer models, testing materials, and scale models of bridges and buildings. Graduate students hunched over laptops, running earthquake simulations and analyzing stress patterns. The air hummed with focused energy, and I felt instantly at home in a way I never had in my dorm or the dining hall.
My first project was simple:
helping to input data from shake table tests into computer models. The shake table was exactly what it sounded like, a platform that could simulate the motion of earthquakes, allowing researchers to see how different structures responded to seismic forces. I spent hours watching tiny bridges and buildings dance and sway as the table moved beneath them, some holding strong while others crumbled in spectacular fashion. The key, Professor Henderson explained during my first week, is understanding that rigidity is often the enemy of survival. The structures that survive major earthquakes aren't necessarily the strongest, they're the most adaptable. I thought about that as I walked back to my dorm through the Cambridge cold, past students complaining about professors and parents and the minor inconveniences of privileged life. Maybe there was something to be said for learning to bend without breaking, for building yourself to withstand forces that would destroy more rigid structures. It was during my second month in the research lab that I first encountered Jordan Mitchell. He was a sophomore studying urban planning, working on a project about emergency evacuation routes in earthquake-prone cities. He needed help understanding the structural engineering side of the problem. Which buildings were likely to survive, which bridges could be counted on during emergency evacuations. He approached me one evening as I was running earthquake simulations, my eyes tired from staring at computer screens. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful and polite. "Professor Henderson said you might be able to help me understand bridge failure modes?" I looked up at him, taking in his patient smile and the genuine curiosity in his eyes. Most students in the lab treated the undergraduate research assistants like invisible help, but he was looking at me like I might actually know something worth hearing. "What specifically do you need to know?" I asked. "I'm trying to figure out which bridges in a city are most likely to fail during a major earthquake, for evacuation planning." He pulled up a chair, apparently settling in for a real conversation. "I understand the basics, but I need to know about different failure modes, what happens when." For the next hour, I walked him through everything I'd learned about bridge engineering. We talked about the different ways structures could fail: cable snapping, foundation settling, resonance effects that could tear a bridge apart from the inside. I found myself getting animated, drawing diagrams on scrap paper and explaining the elegant mathematics that governed how forces moved through complex structures. "This is fascinating," he said when I finally paused for breath. "You really understand this stuff." "It's not that complicated once you see the patterns," I said, though I was pleased by his attention. It had been months since anyone had seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about anything. "Maybe not for you," he said with a laugh. "I'm pretty sure you just explained structural engineering better than my professor did all semester." Something warm uncurled in my chest at the compliment. I had gotten used to being invisible, to keeping my head down and my thoughts to myself. Having someone actually listen, actually engage with my ideas, felt like discovering I'd been holding my breath for months. We started meeting regularly after that. Jordan would bring his urban planning questions, and I'd help him understand the engineering principles he needed. In return, he shared his perspective on how cities worked as living systems, how human behavior and infrastructure intersected in ways that pure engineering couldn't predict. Slowly, I began to understand what I'd been missing. Academic success was important, but it wasn't everything. The other students weren't necessarily smarter or more deserving. They just learned earlier how to build networks, how to find people who shared their interests and could help them grow. Jordan was the first person at MIT who seemed to see me as a whole person rather than just a scholarship case or a brilliant but antisocial engineer. He remembered details about my life, asked how my research was going, and never seemed intimidated by the fact that I often knew more about the technical subjects we discussed. "You know," he said one evening as we walked back from the library, "you should think about presenting your earthquake simulation work at the undergraduate research conference." "I'm just a freshman," I said automatically. "So? You're doing graduate-level work. Professor Henderson wouldn't have you in her lab if you weren't capable." The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. Standing up in front of other students and faculty, presenting my work as if I belonged there, as if my ideas mattered, it felt like stepping onto another bridge that might lead somewhere I'd never imagined I could go. But that night, as I sat in my dorm room working on my latest earthquake simulation, I found myself thinking about Jordan's suggestion. Maybe it was time to stop hiding in the library and start believing that I had something valuable to contribute. Maybe the girl who'd been thrown off a bridge in Cedar Falls could learn to build bridges of her own.
The undergraduate research conference was held in MIT's largest lecture hall, and as I stood backstage clutching my presentation notes, I could hear the low murmur of voices filling the auditorium. 300 students and faculty members, all there to hear undergraduates present their research findings. I was scheduled to speak about my earthquake simulation work in 20 minutes, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely read my own handwriting.
"You're going to be fine," Jordan said quietly, appearing beside me with a cup of coffee and the kind of calm presence that had become my anchor over the past few months. "You know this material better than anyone in that room." "That's not the point," I whispered back. "What if I freeze up? What if I forget everything I wanted to say?" "Then you'll improvise," he said with a smile. "You do your best thinking on your feet, anyway." He was right, though I wasn't sure I believed it in that moment. Over the months we'd spent working together, Jordan had seen me at my most confident, explaining complex engineering principles, sketching bridge designs on napkins during late-night study sessions, getting so excited about structural innovations that I forgot to be self-conscious. But this was different. This was standing up in front of people who could judge whether I belonged here, whether the small-town girl with the full scholarship had anything valuable to contribute to the conversation. Professor Henderson appeared in the wings, immaculate as always in her dark suit and the kind of confidence that came from years of commanding respect in male-dominated rooms. "Ready, Pauline?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, trying to inject more confidence into my voice than I felt. "Good. Remember, you're not just presenting data, you're telling a story about how structures survive catastrophic events. Make them understand why this matters." She was right. My research wasn't just about numbers and simulations. It was about understanding how bridges and buildings could be designed to bend without breaking, to absorb massive forces and remain standing. There was something deeply personal about that concept, though I wasn't ready to examine why too closely. When my name was called, I walked onto the stage with as much composure as I could manage. The lights were bright enough that I couldn't see individual faces in the audience, which was probably a mercy. I looked down at my notes one last time, then made a decision that surprised even me. I set them aside and began to speak from the heart. 3 years ago, the Loma Prieta earthquake in California caused 42 deaths and billions of dollars in damage. Most of that damage happened because we designed our infrastructure to resist seismic forces rather than work with them. Tonight, I want to show you what I've learned about building structures that can dance with earthquakes instead of fighting them. For the next 15 minutes, I walked the audience through my research findings. I showed them video footage of my shake table tests, explained how different bridge designs responded to simulated earthquake motion, and demonstrated the mathematical principles that governed structural flexibility. As I spoke, I found my confidence returning. This was what I loved, the elegant intersection of physics and engineering, the way careful design could turn potential catastrophe into manageable stress. The questions afterward were sharp and thoughtful. A graduate student asked about the economic feasibility of implementing my designs in existing infrastructure. A faculty member wanted to know how my work might apply to buildings rather than just bridges. Professor Henderson asked me to explain the relationship between my earthquake simulations and real-world seismic events. I answered each question carefully, drawing on months of research and the kind of deep understanding that came from genuine passion for the subject. By the time I walked off the stage, I felt different. Not just confident, but like I belonged in this room full of brilliant, ambitious people. "That was incredible," Jordan said as soon as I reached the wings. "You completely owned that presentation." "It felt good," I admitted, surprising by my own response. "Really good." Professor Henderson nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Pauline. I've already had 3 faculty members ask about your research. I think it's time we talked about getting you involved in some higher-level projects." The reception afterward was held in the Student Center, and for once, I didn't feel like I was watching other people's lives from the outside. Students and faculty members approached me to ask follow-up questions about my research, to share their own work, to suggest collaborations. I found myself in animated conversations about everything from building codes to emergency response planning, feeling like a full participant rather than an observer. It was during this reception that I met Eleanor Patterson for the first time, though I didn't know then how important she would become in my life.
She was there with her granddaughter, a sophomore studying mechanical engineering, and she'd attended the presentation out of curiosity. "You remind me of myself at your age. All that fire and determination, but still figuring out how to use it." Eleanor was in her 70s, with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. She wore a simple dress and practical shoes, but carried herself with an authority that made you want to stand up straighter. "I work in construction for 40 years, started as a secretary, ended up running my own company. Never had the fancy education you're getting, but I learned that buildings and people aren't so different. Both need strong foundations and the flexibility to weather storms." We talked for nearly an hour about engineering, about the challenges of being a woman in male-dominated fields, about the difference between surviving and thriving. Eleanor had a way of listening that made you want to tell her things you'd never shared with anyone else. Before I knew it, I was talking about my family, about the bridge confrontation that had led me to MIT, and about the loneliness of building a new life from scratch.
"You know," she said when I finally ran out of words, "I've got a small apartment above my garage. Nothing fancy, but it's quiet and cheap. Been looking for the right tenant. Someone who appreciates the value of independence, but understands that accepting help isn't the same as giving up." The offer caught me completely off guard. I'd been living in the dorms, sharing a room with Rebecca and her designer everything, feeling more out of place with each passing month. The idea of having my own space, of living somewhere that felt like home rather than temporary housing, was almost too good to believe. "I couldn't afford much rent," I said honestly. "Didn't ask what you could afford. Asked if you were interested." Eleanor's smile was warm but businesslike. "I need someone to help with small repairs around the property. Nothing complicated, just the kind of maintenance that's easier with two sets of hands. In exchange, you get a place to live and an old woman who makes excellent chocolate chip cookies." That weekend, Jordan helped me move my few belongings from the dorm to Eleanor's garage apartment in Cambridge. The space was small but perfect. A living room with a kitchenette, a bedroom just big enough for a bed and desk, and windows that looked out over Eleanor's garden. For the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, I had a place that felt like it could become home. Eleanor kept her promise about the cookies, but more importantly, she provided something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: maternal wisdom without judgment. She never asked intrusive questions about my family or my past, but she was always available when I needed to talk. She had a gift for practical advice delivered with gentle humor and a way of making problems seem manageable rather than overwhelming. "The secret to a good foundation," she told me one evening as we repaired a loose railing on her front porch, "is making sure it's deep enough and flexible enough to handle whatever gets built on top of it. Same with people. You need to be rooted, but not rigid." My relationship with Jordan was deepening too, though neither of us seemed ready to define what was happening between us. We spent most evenings together, either working on our respective projects or just talking about everything and nothing. He had a way of making me laugh that I'd forgotten was possible, and he listened to my ideas with the kind of attention that made me feel genuinely heard. One night in early spring, we were working late in the engineering lab, running final tests for a project I was presenting at a seismic engineering conference. The building was nearly empty, just the two of us and the quiet hum of computers running overnight simulations. I was adjusting parameters on a shake table test when I felt Jordan watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said, but he was smiling. "It's just, you get this look when you're working on something you care about, like nothing else exists in the world." That's probably not healthy, though I was pleased by his attention. "I think it's beautiful," he said quietly, and something in his voice made me look up sharply. The moment stretched between us, full of possibility and nervousness. I'd been on a few dates in high school, but nothing that felt serious or important. This was different. Jordan was different. He saw me not as the scholarship girl or the small-town kid trying to prove herself, but as someone worth knowing for her own sake.
When he leaned over to kiss me, I didn't pull away. His lips were warm and gentle, and for a moment the lab faded away entirely. When we broke apart, I felt dizzy and exhilarated and terrified all at once. He admitted. "I've been wanting to do that for months," I managed to say. "The shake tables between cycles." He laughed, and the tension broke into something warmer and more comfortable. We didn't talk about what it meant or where it might lead. Instead, we went back to work, but with an awareness of each other that changed everything. Later that night, walking back to Eleanor's house through the Cambridge streets, I found myself thinking about bridges again. Not the mathematical principles or engineering challenges, but the metaphor that got me into Professor Henderson's lab in the first place. I was building connections to my work, to Jordan, to Eleanor, to a future that felt genuinely mine for the first time since leaving home. But even as I felt more settled at MIT than I ever had before, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was incomplete. My success felt hollow without anyone from my family to share it with. And I found myself wondering what my parents would think if they could see me now. Did they ever regret the Bridges confrontation? Did they miss me at all? Or had they simply replaced me with the idea of Trevor and Sandra's future children? I pushed those thoughts away as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. I had a presentation to prepare for, research to complete, and a new relationship to figure out. The past was the past, and I was finally building a future that belonged entirely to me. But late that night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of Cambridge settling around me, I couldn't help but wonder if the bridges I was learning to build would ever be strong enough to span the gap between the life I'd chosen and the family I'd left behind.
The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was reviewing structural calculations for my senior thesis. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code made my stomach clench. Oregon. Cedar Falls. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "Pauline?" The voice was deeper than I remembered, uncertain. "It's Danny. My little brother." Except he wasn't little anymore. He'd be 19 now, older than I was when I left home. I sat down hard in my desk chair, the engineering diagram suddenly forgotten. "Danny," I whispered, "how did you get this number?" "I've been trying to find you for months," he said, his words rushing together like he was afraid I'd hang up. "Mom and Dad don't know I'm calling. They'd kill me if they found out." The silence stretched between us, heavy with 3 years of forbidden contact. I could hear background noise, machinery, the kind of industrial sounds that meant he was calling from the factory. Following in Dad's footsteps, just like everyone expected. "How are they?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Not great," Danny said honestly. "Dad's been having heart problems. The stress of the factory closures, you know. They laid off half the crew last year. And Mom," he paused, "Mom asks about you sometimes, when Dad's not around. She wonders if you're okay." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar ache that came with thoughts of home. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Working at Morrison Steel now, learning to be a machinist. It's good work." There was something forced about his cheerfulness, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "But Pauline, I had to call. I've been reading about you." "Reading about me?" "The engineering magazines at the library. Your earthquake research made the Journal of Structural Engineering. They mentioned you're from Cedar Falls." Pride crept into his voice. "My sister, the famous engineer." I felt a complex mix of emotions. Happiness that he was proud of me, sadness that we'd missed so much of each other's lives, and a deep ache for the family connection I'd been forced to abandon. "It's not fame," I said quietly. "It's just research." "Don't do that," Danny said firmly. "Don't minimize what you've accomplished. Dad might not understand it, but I do. You are building things that save lives." We talked for an hour, catching up on everything we'd missed. He told me about his job, about the girl he was dating, about how the town had changed since the factory started struggling. I told him about MIT, about my research, about Jordan, though I kept the details vague. "Do you ever think about coming home?" he asked as our conversation wound down. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not to stay. Too much has happened.
Yeah, no. But maybe someday for a visit, things might be different now. After he hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the phone. Eleanor found me there an hour later, brought me tea, and listened while I worked through the complicated emotions Danny's call had stirred up. She didn't offer easy answers, just the comfort of being heard. That weekend, I found myself driving toward Oregon. I hadn't planned it, had told myself I was just going for a drive to clear my head. But as the miles passed and the landscape became familiar, I knew where I was headed. I stopped at a gas station just outside Cedar Falls, my hands shaking as I filled the tank. Through the dusty windows, I could see the town spread out below, smaller than I remembered, the downtown looking tired and worn. The factory smokestacks stood silent against the gray sky. I drove through the main street slowly, cataloging the changes. Half the shops were boarded up, victims of the economic downturn Danny had described. But the bridge was still there, spanning the river like it had for 50 years, carrying traffic between the old town and the newer developments on the east side. I parked at the overlook, where tourists used to stop to take pictures of the bridge, and sat in my car staring at the structure that had changed my life. From this distance, it looked solid, permanent, but I could see things now that I'd missed as a teenager. The rust stains on the cables, the slight sag in the center span, the way the whole structure swayed more than it should in the wind. The bridge was aging, showing signs of metal fatigue and insufficient maintenance. With my engineering training, I could see that it needed significant work, probably a complete renovation within the next decade. The irony wasn't lost on me. The bridge that had ended my relationship with my family might someday need the expertise I'd gained in my exile. I didn't stop to see my parents. I wasn't ready for that confrontation, might never be ready. Instead, I drove back to Boston, carrying with me a new understanding of how complicated forgiveness could be. My senior thesis grew out of that trip. I found myself designing emergency stabilization systems for aging suspension bridges, focusing specifically on structures that had been built in the 1950s and were now showing their age. The Cedar Falls Bridge became my case study, though I was careful not to mention the personal connection. Jordan noticed my increased obsession with this particular project. "You've been working on this bridge design for weeks," he said one evening, finding me hunched over my laptop in the lab. "It's brilliant work, but why this specific structure?" I looked at the screen, at the detailed models I'd created of a bridge that existed in real life, in a town that felt both foreign and like home. "Sometimes you have to solve the problems that matter to you personally," I said, "even if no one asks you to."
5 years after graduation, my consulting firm occupied 3 floors of a sleek building in downtown San Francisco. Williams Structural Engineering had grown from my one-woman operation into a team of 12 brilliant engineers, all specializing in earthquake-resistant infrastructure. We'd designed bridges for 3 major cities, consulted on seismic upgrades for critical buildings, and earned a reputation for innovative solutions to impossible problems. Success should have felt better than it did. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking out at the San Francisco Bay Bridge while talking to a client in Tokyo about their subway tunnel project. The conversation was conducted in the efficient shorthand of international engineering: stress calculations, seismic coefficients, construction timelines. When I hung up, the silence felt overwhelming. Another late night, Jordan appeared in my doorway, carrying takeout containers from our favorite Thai restaurant. He joined the firm 2 years ago, bringing his urban planning expertise to complement our structural work. The partnership was professional and personal. We'd moved in together, built a life that looked successful from the outside. "The Tokyo project is fascinating," I said, accepting the container he offered. "They want to retrofit subway tunnels to withstand 9.0 earthquakes. The engineering challenges are incredible." "And the Singapore bridge?" "Signed the contract this morning. $40 million over 3 years. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I felt the familiar emptiness that seemed to follow even my biggest victories. Jordan studied me with the patient attention that had made him such a good friend all those years ago at MIT. "You know what your problem is?" "I have many problems. You'll need to be specific." "You've built exactly the career you dreamed of, but you're still that 16-year-old girl trying to prove she belongs on the bridge." His words hit harder than I expected.
I thought I'd moved past the need for approval, had built my self-worth on solid professional ground. But he was right. Every project felt like an attempt to prove something to people who weren't even watching. The reminder came in an envelope from Oregon, forwarded through 3 address changes, but somehow finding its way to my office. Danny's handwriting on the outside, careful and precise, like everything else about him. Inside were newspaper clippings from the Cedar Falls Gazette, small articles about my firm's latest projects, my speaking engagements, a mention of my TED Talk on building infrastructure that could survive climate change. The last clipping was different. A photo from the town's annual Bridge Festival, showing my parents among the crowd. Dad looked older, grayer, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that spoke of ongoing health problems. Mom stood beside him, and for just a moment in the photographer's snapshot, she was looking away from the camera, her expression wistful and sad. Danny's note was brief. They read every article. They won't admit it, but they're proud. Thought you should know. That evening, Jordan found me on our apartment's balcony, staring out at the lights of the city. The container of Thai food sat untouched beside me. Want to talk about it? He asked, settling into the chair beside me. I handed him the clippings without a word. He read through them carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. Must be complicated, he said finally. I spent years angry at them. Then I spent years not thinking about them at all. Now I don't know what I feel. Have you considered that maybe you don't have to know? Maybe it's okay to just feel whatever comes up without needing to categorize it? That night, Jordan asked me to marry him. The proposal was perfect. Intimate, thoughtful, everything I should have wanted. He'd planned it carefully, chosen a ring that reflected my practical nature, but acknowledged that I'd grown to appreciate beautiful things. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to build a life together, that he couldn't imagine a future without me in it. I panicked. Not because I didn't love him. I did, desperately, completely. But because accepting his proposal felt like admitting that this life I'd built was real, permanent, mine to keep. Some part of me was still waiting for it all to be taken away, still expecting the phone call that would summon me back to Cedar Falls to face the music I'd been avoiding for years. I need time to think, I told him, and saw the hurt flash across his face before he hid it behind understanding. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. But time wasn't the issue. The issue was the girl who'd been thrown off a bridge 15 years ago, who'd built her entire identity around proving she didn't need the people who'd rejected her. That girl wasn't ready to believe in permanent happiness, wasn't ready to trust that the ground beneath her feet was solid enough to support the weight of real commitment. 3 weeks later, I was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Seismic Engineering in Seattle. The topic was Building Bridges That Last, a title that seemed increasingly ironic as I struggled with my own inability to commit to the relationship I valued most. The speech went well. I talked about the engineering principles that allowed structures to survive catastrophic events, about the importance of flexibility and redundancy in design. I discussed case studies of bridges that had failed and bridges that had endured, drawing connections between structural engineering and broader principles of resilience. In the question and answer session afterward, someone asked about the personal inspiration for my work.
I think everyone in structural engineering is ultimately trying to solve the same problem, I said. How do you build something that will last? How do you create connections that can withstand the forces trying to tear them apart? For me, bridges aren't just about getting from one place to another. They're about the possibility of connection across seemingly impossible gaps. As I spoke, I realized I was describing not just my professional philosophy, but the central challenge of my personal life. I'd become an expert at building physical structures that could survive earthquakes, but I'd never learned how to build emotional connections that could survive the smaller tremors of daily life. That night, in my hotel room overlooking Seattle's skyline, I made a decision. I called Jordan and told him yes. Yes to marriage, yes to building a life together, yes to believing that some foundations were strong enough to last. He cried when I told him, and for the first time in weeks, the future felt solid beneath my feet. But even as I celebrated this personal breakthrough, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. My success felt incomplete without my family to share it, and I found myself wondering if the bridges I'd learned to build professionally could somehow span the personal gap that had defined my adult life. The answer would come sooner than I expected, and in a way that would test everything I'd learned about engineering impossible solutions to catastrophic problems. The earthquake hit at 6:47 p.m. Pacific Time on a Tuesday evening in October. I was in my San Francisco office reviewing final calculations for the Singapore project when the building began to sway. After years of designing earthquake-resistant structures, I had an almost supernatural awareness of seismic motion. This wasn't the gentle rolling of a distant tremor. This was close, powerful, and still building. I grabbed my desk as the shaking intensified, watching my coffee mug slide across the surface and crash to the floor. The building groaned around me, but it held. Good engineering, I thought automatically, even as adrenaline flooded my system. The motion lasted 43 seconds, long enough to be terrifying, short enough to be survivable. My phone buzzed with emergency alerts before the shaking had fully stopped. Magnitude 7.2, epicenter in the Cascade Range of Oregon. My blood went cold as I realized what that meant. Cedar Falls sat directly in the path of the seismic waves, and that bridge, the aging suspension bridge that had haunted my thesis work, would have taken the full brunt of the earthquake's force. I pulled up the live news feeds on my computer, my hands shaking as I searched for information about my hometown. The reports were scattered and confused, but one detail kept appearing: extensive damage to critical infrastructure, including the historic Cedar Falls Bridge. Then I saw the helicopter footage, and my world tilted. The bridge was still standing, but barely. The main cables had snapped on the east side, leaving the roadway suspended at a dangerous angle. Worse, there were people on it, dozens of them, trapped during what must have been an evening rush hour evacuation. The local news reporter was saying something about residents fleeing to higher ground when the earthquake hit, but I wasn't listening to her words. I was studying the structural damage with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years modeling exactly this scenario. The bridge was going to collapse. Not immediately, but soon. The remaining cables couldn't support the full load indefinitely, and aftershocks would weaken them further. Anyone still on that span had maybe hours before the entire structure gave way. My office door burst open. Jordan rushed in, his face pale with worry. "Are you okay? I felt it all the way across town." "Jordan?" My voice sounded strange, distant. "That's my hometown." He followed my gaze to the computer screen, where the news footage showed the damaged bridge in stark detail. I could see tiny figures moving on the roadway, people who had nowhere to go, trapped between the collapsed sections and the failing support structure. "Jesus," he whispered. "How many people?" "I don't know, dozens, maybe more." I was already pulling up my engineering software, my mind racing through calculations. The bridge is going to fail completely. The remaining cables can't hold that load for long. My phone rang. Unknown number, Oregon area code. I answered without thinking. "Ms. Williams, this is Mayor Bob Crawford from Cedar Falls. I apologize for calling you directly, but we have an emergency situation here." Mayor Crawford. I remembered him vaguely from childhood. He'd been the public works director back then, always patient with the curious little girl who asked too many questions about how things worked. "I'm watching the news coverage," I said. "How can I help?" "We've got 73 people trapped on the bridge, including," his voice caught slightly, "including your parents, Ms. Williams. The conventional rescue options aren't working. We need someone who understands structural engineering, and you're the only expert with a connection to this specific bridge." My parents. My parents were on that failing bridge, facing the same fate I'd once imagined for myself in much darker moments. The irony was so sharp it cut. "What kind of resources do you have available?" I asked, my professional training taking over even as my personal world reeled. "Limited. Local fire department, some National Guard units that managed to get through, but the roads are damaged and we can't get heavy equipment close enough to the bridge to attempt a conventional rescue." I was already sketching emergency stabilization options on my whiteboard, my mind automatically running through the possibilities. The solution would need to be fast, achievable with limited resources, and capable of holding the damaged structure for long enough for a full evacuation. "I have an emergency stabilization system," I said slowly. "Something I developed for exactly this type of failure, but it's never been tested in real-world conditions. Will it work?" "I don't know," I admitted. But it's the only chance those people have. There was a long pause. How quickly can you get here? I looked at Jordan, who was already grabbing his jacket. He nodded before I could ask the question. We'll be there in 4 hours, I said. As I packed my emergency kit, laptop, portable stress analysis equipment, copies of my emergency stabilization protocols, I found myself thinking about the strange circular nature of fate. The bridge that had destroyed my relationship with my family was now the bridge that might save their lives. Everything I'd learned about engineering resilient structures was about to be tested on the structure that had taught me my first lesson about catastrophic failure. Jordan loaded my equipment into his SUV while I made rapid phone calls to my team, arranging for additional resources to be flown north if needed. As we pulled out of the parking garage and headed toward the freeway, I caught a glimpse of myself in the side mirror. I looked older than my 31 years, marked by the kind of confidence that came from solving impossible problems for a living. But underneath that professional competence, I was still the 16-year-old girl who'd been thrown off a bridge by her own family. And now I was racing back to save them from a bridge that was determined to finish what we'd started all those years ago. The drive north passed in a blur of highway lights and emergency radio chatter. Jordan handled the driving while I worked on my laptop, refining the stabilization calculations and running stress analyses on the damaged bridge structure. Every few minutes, I checked the news updates, watching the helicopter footage with the detached focus of an engineer and the desperate anxiety of a daughter. As we crossed into Oregon, I could see the glow of emergency lights in the distance. Cedar Falls looked smaller than I remembered, but the bridge loomed as large as ever against the night sky. Even from miles away, I could see the unnatural angle of the roadway, the way the whole structure seemed to sag under its own weight. "You ready for this?" Jordan asked as we took the exit toward town. I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready to face my parents after 15 years of silence? Was I ready to risk my own life to save people who'd rejected me? Was I ready to bet everything on an untested engineering solution? No, I said, honestly. But I'm the only one who can do it. As we drove into Cedar Falls, past the signs welcoming visitors to Oregon's bridge capital, I realized that everything I'd built since leaving home had been leading to this moment. The girl who'd been thrown off the bridge was coming back as the engineer who might save it. Whether that was redemption or just another kind of catastrophe remained to be seen. The emergency command center had been hastily established in the Cedar Falls fire station, a chaos of radio chatter, emergency maps, and grim faces. When Jordan and I walked through the door at midnight, conversation stopped. I realized that half the room recognized me, the girl who'd left in disgrace 15 years ago, now returning as their only hope. Mayor Crawford looked older than his voice had suggested, his face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from making impossible decisions. "Ms. Williams, thank God you're here." I set my equipment case on the nearest table and pulled up the structural analysis on my laptop. "Show me the current situation." The news was worse than the television coverage had suggested. 73 people remained trapped on the bridge, including emergency workers who'd been attempting evacuations when the aftershocks hit. The remaining support cables were showing signs of metal fatigue, and conventional rescue attempts had failed due to the unstable structure. "What about helicopters?" Crawford explained. "Wind shear around the bridge is too dangerous. We lost contact with one crew already." I studied the real-time footage from the emergency cameras positioned around the bridge. My parents were visible in one frame. Dad sitting on the roadway, clearly struggling with chest pains, while Mom crouched beside him. Seeing them after all these years, vulnerable and terrified, made my throat tighten. "How long do we have?" Crawford asked. I ran the calculations quickly, factoring in the damaged cables, the load distribution, and the probability of additional aftershocks. 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky, but that's assuming no more seismic activity. "And your emergency stabilization system?" "It's designed for exactly this scenario, a temporary solution to hold a damaged bridge long enough for evacuation." I pulled up the technical specifications. "But it requires precise placement of emergency cables and will need a crew willing to work directly under the damaged structure." Crawford nodded grimly. "Whatever you need." What I needed was a miracle, but I kept that thought to myself.
The installation began at dawn, with volunteer crews working in shifts to position the emergency support cables. The system I designed was elegant in its simplicity. Tension steel cables attached to portable anchor points, creating a temporary redundancy that could distribute the bridge's load across multiple support structures. Trevor Morrison emerged from the crowd of volunteers, older now but still carrying himself with the quiet competence that had made him valuable at the factory. "Pauline, heard you needed people who understand how to work with cables under pressure."
The irony of my former suitor helping to save my parents wasn't lost on me, but there was no time for awkwardness. Trevor had become the factory's safety supervisor, and his crew understood industrial rigging better than anyone else in town. "We need to position these anchors precisely," I explained, showing him the placement diagrams. "Any deviation from the calculated positions could cause catastrophic failure." As the crews worked, I monitored the bridge's stability through my portable sensors. Each cable installation increased the overall structural integrity, but the work was dangerous. One miscalculation could bring down the entire span. Through my radio headset, I heard my mother's voice for the first time in 15 years. She was helping to calm other trapped evacuees, her waitress training serving her well in crisis management. When she recognized my voice coordinating the rescue, the silence that followed carried 15 years of regret. "Pauline?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is that really you?" "Focus on keeping everyone calm, Mom. We're going to get you out of there." The critical moment came when we installed the final support cable. The bridge shuddered as the new load distribution took effect, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the entire structure might collapse. Then the sensors showed stabilization. The emergency system was holding. "Evacuation can begin," I announced over the radio. The community center buzzed with relief and celebration as the last evacuee was brought to safety. Families reunited, emergency workers compared notes, and the media documented Cedar Falls' improbable rescue story. But I sat apart from the celebration, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions I'd been suppressing for hours. My parents approached hesitantly, Dad leaning heavily on Mom's arm. Up close, I could see how the years had changed them. Dad's hair completely gray now, lines of worry etched around Mom's eyes. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by time and struggle. "Pauline," Dad's voice was hoarse from the stress of the evacuation. We wanted to thank you." The words hung between us, inadequate for the magnitude of what had just happened. Here were the people who'd thrown me away, saved by the expertise they'd once scorned. "You don't need to thank me," I said quietly. "It's what I do." Mom stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I should have defended you that day on the bridge. I should have been a better mother. I'm so sorry." The apology I had imagined demanding for 15 years felt hollow now that it had finally come. All those years of anger and hurt seemed suddenly trivial in the face of how close I'd come to losing them forever. "I know," I said simply. "I know you are." Dad struggled with his words, pride warring with gratitude. "Your brother's been sending us articles about your work. I never understood what you were trying to do, but tonight," he gestured toward the bridge, still standing because of my emergency system. "Tonight, I understand." Danny appeared beside them, pulling me into a fierce hug that felt like coming home. "You did it, sis! You actually did it!" Dr. Janet Collins, the family friend who'd become Cedar Falls' crisis counselor, facilitated our awkward reunion with gentle wisdom. She helped us navigate the conversation we should have had 15 years ago, about dreams and expectations, about the difference between loving someone and trying to control them. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing to build something new from what remains. I looked at my parents, really looked at them for the first time since my return. They weren't the giants of my childhood memories, or the villains of my teenage anger. They were just people, flawed and struggling, who'd made mistakes they couldn't take back. "I don't know how to fix this," I admitted. "Maybe you don't have to fix it all at once," Mom said. "Maybe you just have to decide if you want to try." Jordan found us there an hour later, exhausted but relieved that the immediate crisis had passed. I introduced him to my family, watched him charm my parents with his easy warmth and genuine interest in their stories. This was the life I'd built without them, and for the first time I could see the possibility of bringing those worlds together. The emergency was over,
But the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, painting the damaged bridge in golden light, I realized that some structures could be repaired, some relationships could be rebuilt, and some bridges could be crossed again if you were willing to do the engineering. 6 months later, I stood on the new Cedar Falls Bridge as Mayor Crawford prepared to cut the ribbon. The structure beneath my feet was a testament to everything I'd learned about engineering resilient connections: earthquake-resistant cables, flexible foundations, and backup systems designed to prevent catastrophic failure. My parents stood in the crowd, Dad looking healthier after his heart surgery, Mom beaming with undisguised pride. The relationship we were rebuilding wasn't perfect, but it was real. We'd learned to talk about our differences instead of letting them fester into resentment. Jordan squeezed my hand as I approached the microphone. The engagement ring caught the afternoon sunlight, a symbol of my own willingness to trust in permanent connections.
This bridge represents more than just transportation infrastructure, I began, looking out at the familiar faces of my hometown. It's proof that when structures fail, we can rebuild them stronger. When connections break, we can engineer new ones that will last. In the front row, Danny grinned at me with unabashed pride. Behind him, Eleanor Patterson had made the trip from Boston, her presence a reminder that family was something you could choose as well as inherit. Trevor Morrison caught my eye and nodded respectfully. He'd married his longtime girlfriend the previous spring, built a good life within the boundaries that had once felt like prison walls to me. We'd found our separate paths to contentment. As the ceremony concluded, I walked to the center of the bridge, where my life had changed direction 15 years ago. The river flowed beneath us, carrying away the debris of old conflicts. I thought about the girl who'd been thrown off this bridge, who'd used that rejection as the foundation for everything she'd built since. "You know what the best part is?" I said to Jordan as we walked back toward town. "What's that?" "I finally understand what Professor Henderson meant about flexibility being stronger than rigidity. This bridge will bend with the earthquakes instead of fighting them, just like we learned to do." The afternoon sun painted Cedar Falls in golden light as we drove away, but this time with promises to return for holidays, for family dinners, for the slow work of rebuilding trust. The bridges I'd learned to design had taught me something essential about human connections. They required strong foundations, flexible joints, and enough redundancy to survive the occasional failure. Behind us, the new bridge stood ready to carry traffic between past and future, a permanent reminder that sometimes the best engineering solutions come from understanding exactly how and why the previous structures had failed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.